Hi, welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. International thriller master Joseph Finder has been entertaining fans for decades with bestsellers like Paranoia, High Crimes, Company Men, and Killer Instinct. He joins us tonight, and we're so excited to have him on the show. Joe, thanks for taking time out. You strike me as the type of kid that grew up reading James Bond more than the Hardy Boys. What kind of books really first thrilled your imagination as a child?
When I was pretty young, my parents had the Ian Fleming books on a shelf, sort of high up, and I got one down one day, and I sort of sat there in the basement and read it all the way through, and loved it. And I so I think I was into writing adventure kind of stories from as soon as I discovered Ian Fleming when I was a kid. I think that's probably where it started. I grew up in a house with five kids, and it was jammed with books. I mean, there were bookcases everywhere, and down in the basement there was this big library
Oh,
of,
wow.
of books. And my parents were both school teachers. My dad was a university professor, and they, I mean, they gave us books to read. They had favorite books when we were little. Uh, they took us to the library regularly to get books. So it was a very book-centric family that I grew up in. And I decided I wanted to become a writer really pretty early on. I mean, and this happens to a lot. You'll find this a lot of writers you talk to. I bet you've done the same thing,
Yeah.
where they just decided when they were 8 years old they wanted to do this, and I did too. And you kind of go through, you grow up, and people try to talk you out of it, and the world you have to sort of fight the world to get accepted as a writer. Uh, but those of us who make it as writers do it because they have this we have this deep fascination with telling a story, just telling a story. That's all it is.
You, like some of the authors we've spoken to, grew up living abroad for a period of your childhood. How would you say living in these international backdrops help influence the books you wrote in the future?
I grew up outside of the country, in Afghanistan and the Philippines in particular, because my dad was a Fulbright scholar and he moved the family around the world. So I became interested in international events and international worlds that are different from ours. And when I was, I think, in high school, I I discovered the stories of a writer named Nikolai Gogol, which are kind of weird, phantasmagorical stories, and weird things happen. And I read this and I just sort of thought, I want to read about a country where someone writes like this. My first language wasn't English, believe it or not.
What was it?
It was Farsi. Um, so because my parents were gone during the day when we lived in Kabul, and I was raised by the servants during the day. They would take care of me, and they spoke to me only in Farsi. And so the fact, and then I actually would translate when I was like 3 years old, translate for my parents. They would ask something, and I would tell the servants what my parents wanted. So the idea of sort of living in two different worlds, two different cultures, two different languages, that really was formative to me. Um, so I don't know. I think that there's a reason that I started writing international thrillers, because I was intrigued by taking a character and plunging him into these different worlds. So it sort of came that way. So I became when I was in college, I studied Russia largely because I discovered Nikolai Gogol, as I mentioned. And what interested me was not Russian culture so much as espionage and the sort of spy world, and the sort of things that we were doing and the things the Russians were doing. So I wrote a lot about Soviet politics.
You're actually listed as a member of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, and the CIA did try to recruit you right out of college, correct? Tell us a little bit about how that actually works.
One of my professors in Russian invited me to have lunch with him at this club in New Haven called Maury's. And so I went to Maury's with him and this guy who worked for the CIA, who was very interested in bringing in, so basically people who were Russian majors, and especially someone like me who was writing about intelligence and international politics. That was just the sort of person the CIA wanted to recruit, and they told me about it. So it was very kind of old world the way I was recruited, you know. So I mean that was, but I decided pretty early on that this wasn't for me.
Do you mind if I ask why?
I had friends who went into the business, the spy business. I made friends in the spy business. I helped out in certain ways. I traveled a lot to Russia. And the thing is, I spoke Russian pretty fluently. So I was able to sort of pass as a Russian at some points when I was in Moscow.
You actually wrote your first published book, Red Carpet, The Connection Between the Kremlin and America's Most Powerful Businessmen, while you were still in graduate school, correct?
My first professional assignment was a book, actually, not an article. I just had this idea. And where did I get the idea? It was, I was in grad school reading the letters of Lenin in Russian. And Lenin wrote letters to a guy named Dr. Armand Hammer. And then I did some more research and I found out that Lenin and Armand Hammer's father were both acquainted. And Armand Hammer's father had founded the American Communist Party. And I just sort of thought, what a rich irony this is, that someone who is this great capitalist, billionaire, has such an affinity for the communist world. So that's what drew me in. That's what gave me the idea for Red Carpet. The title came from talking to David Rockefeller. I interviewed him. He was another capitalist the Russians loved, and he told me that he said, when I go to Russia, they really lay out the red carpet for me. And I heard red carpet, and I just sort of thought red, and that's good. And I sort of thought that was a perfect title for the book. I did a lot of interviewing. I said my feeling was that in order to make it real to the reader, I had to sort of find out the real world stuff myself, and I had to talk to people who were involved in this weird world of where rich capitalists were interacting with communists.
You're categorized as a fiction novelist, but there's a whole lot of fact that finds its way into your books. I think the Moscow Club in 1991 is a great example of that, which actually is set in a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev.
The idea for the Moscow Club came when I was doing research for my first book, Red Carpet. And I interviewed an old man, that's sort of a well-known diplomat named Averell Harriman. He was the governor of New York. He was a very wealthy guy. The Russians loved him. He loved Russia. I was interviewing him, and he was 90-something when I talked to him. Really an old guy. And he told me that he had all these archives in the basement of his townhouse in Georgetown. And I said to him, could I look through the archives? And he said, go ahead. So he said, go ahead and you go down there and just, you'll figure it out for yourself. So I went down to this archive, and I found letters from Stalin that had never been printed, published anywhere. I found all kinds of inside stuff. It was an amazing experience. And I sort of sat there and I started taking notes, and I found a Xerox machine down there. I made photocopies, and I was there. Basically, I did not come up. And I think they forgot about me in the house. And then it was like 8 o'clock at night. Harriman called. I picked up the phone, and he said, who's this? And I said, this is Joseph Finder, the writer. I interviewed you this morning, And he said, what are you doing down there? I said, you said I could do some research here. He said, no, get out of there. He sort of kicked me out. And I sort of thought, how cool would this be if an ordinary person, a writer, a researcher, was ghostwriting a memoir, let's say, and found in the archives of the person he's writing about an explosive document. I decided pretty early on, after I started writing, that I wanted to make him not just a writer, but someone who did research for CIA. I wanted to make him someone who had the credentials and the sort of the credibility of someone who worked for the CIA. So that's where it started. That's where Moscow Club started, with me in the basement of Averell Harriman's townhouse.
Developing sources is such a key part of a thriller writer's access to gaining behind-the-scenes materials, case files, etc. that really make their books more authentic for readers. How did you first develop yours back in the day?
One major thing is to interview people who are retired, because retirees have time, have lots of experience, and usually are not constricted. They're not forbidden to talk to journalists. So I talked to a number of retired CIA people when I did research for the Moscow Club. And as a result, I was able to get information that I would otherwise not have gotten. If you go to the CIA through the front door, they basically tell you, go away.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're with the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you'll get an interview, but there's going to be the press people will be there watching you to make sure you don't ask too many questions. You know, so unless you are a professional journalist, the best way to get into that world is to talk to retirees. It's amazingly productive.
I wanted to ask you this for years after reading Extraordinary Powers. Where did you first get the idea to plant a mole inside the CIA?
The idea for this mole at the top of the CIA, I got from a kind of a legendary spy named James Jesus Angleton. And Angleton was a very senior CIA officer who became convinced that there was a mole at the top of the CIA. And I talked to Angleton, and he told me he believed this. And we talked about that. And I just sort of thought, when I was writing my second novel, I just sort of thought, what if Angleton is right? What if there really is a mole right at the top of the CIA? And I thought, how cool would that be? And that sort of powered this. That was the what if behind Extraordinary Powers. Some of it I just make up totally because I have no idea. And I figure if I get it wrong, I get it wrong. But basically, I interview people and ask them to describe what their workplace was like. And people, that's the sort of thing they can talk about, you know? So that's the main way I do it.
How surreal for you was it when you saw books like The 0 Hour continue to rocket up the charts? And also, changing up locations from book to book was really important for you early on. Is that something you recommend for aspiring thriller authors?
What I dread is doing the same thing over and over and over again. I just think that you read these books where authors do the same character, same story, really, over and over again, and you forget it, and you say, have I read this book before? You know, it's too familiar, right? You know? And so I decided that I wanted to shake things up in my writing career from time to time and not do the same thing over and over again. And with 0 Hour, I just said, you know what? I'm tired of writing about Russia and the end of the Cold War. I want to do something completely fresh. And I sort of thought, well, you know something? I talked to some experts in terrorism, and I realized there had not been a major terrorist attack in the United States. And how could that happen? How could that come about? And so the people that I talked to, I said, so who are the most effective terrorists in the world? And they all said that it would have to be someone who was trained in the intelligence agency, who knows how to get from one place to the other using fake passports and that sort of thing. And so, I mean, that's basically how it started. I had this one source, a really good source, who told me how he got fake passports. And they've gotten really hard now. I mean, you've got to get the actual document. You have to steal it and then redo it. It's really hard. This is the same guy who told me, I said, how could I smuggle a gun to Moscow if I wanted to? Could I do that? And he said, there's a gun maker called Glock, and they make these largely plastic guns, and he would disassemble it, put it this piece in your luggage, this piece in your shaving kit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I learned from him how to. In fact, we tried it. We showed me a gun, and he smuggled it on a plane from Boston to Washington. So I mean, it was an experiment we tried. When I did the research for Zero Hour, I talked to this one guy who had been a professional terrorist for the US government working in Central America. And we've got these people, of course we do. And, I told him, don't worry, I'm not going to use your name. I'll protect your identity. And he said, I'm not afraid. You've seen what I can do. I can kill people with my hands. I'm not afraid.
Have you ever had sources approach you with an idea for a book?
Yeah, no, I have. I had this one source, FBI, who was, in fact, at that time, the head of counterterrorism at FBI. And we sat there and talked about my new book, and he had ideas that were different. He said, no, I think it would play out like this.
Which book?
So that was for the Zero Hour. And it sort of shaped the story. The story evolved from talking to my sources. So I do have sources, in answer to your question, who will give me suggestions, and I usually take them. The point of doing research is not to sort of get every fact right. It's to get all the cool ideas that you might not know about, that are not written about, that are not in books or magazine articles or things like that. You learn these cool things from talking to people who've done it.
I imagine there's a freedom in being able to fictionalize all that fact and take it where you want on the page.
There's a freedom to writing fiction. And this is one of the things I found very constricting about when I was a graduate student in the Russian Research Center at Harvard, where if you get a fact wrong, people think the thesis is wrong. I mean, you've got to be very, very careful. And I was more interested in exploring ideas that you couldn't explore in nonfiction. And what I found was that when I would go to a source and tell them I'm writing a novel, they would be much more likely to talk to me, a writer of fiction, than they would be to talk to a reporter. So reporters basically are dangerous for a lot of these people. But if you're writing a novel that's like, well, okay, I can imagine along with you. So yeah, I think you can tell stories in fiction based on fact that are persuasive. And so people, my Zero Hour came out before 9/11.
Yeah.
And it was my feeling from talking to experts in terrorism that we were going to be hit in the US. Don't know when, but it's going to happen. Someone will figure out how to do this. So basically I predicted it. Or my book, The Moscow Club, was about a coup in Moscow against Gorbachev. So where did I get this idea? From talking to friends of mine in the CIA who said they believed this was going to happen, but they couldn't. You can't say this in the New York Times. You can't say that there's a coup against Gorbachev is about to happen. That's sort of too speculative. But if you're writing fiction, you can explore these things, tell these stories that the insiders want to tell but can't.
With High Crimes, you take readers inside how a court-martial actually works. Where did that idea first come to you?
It actually started with the story behind High Crimes started with a friend of mine, this woman, who came over one day and told us that she had found a driver's license that belonged to her husband, and it was a different name. And she said, I mean, I don't even know who this guy is. And I heard this and I just sort of thought, wow, what if this happened to one of my characters, where a woman's husband is somebody who she didn't know, who has sort of a secret life. I thought that would be really cool to write about. As I began to sort of cook the story, think about it more and more, I thought, let's go with this idea of a marriage, a woman who's married to a guy who's accused of something terrible, an atrocity, and yet believes he's innocent. What kind of courtroom could that happen in? And I wanted it to be a kind of place where that involved secret intelligence, which would not happen in a regular courtroom. It would have to be a court martial. So I went to a number of court martials and watched them, took notes. And in fact, this one judge sort of recognized me after 3 different court martials I'd been to, and said, and she, during a break, she said, called me up and said, "Who are you and what are you doing?" You're allowed to go to court martials; they're public. So I went to a bunch of these, and then the best thing I did was I talked to lawyers who had done court martials, either as defense or as prosecution, and talked to them. And I said, so tell me about some great moments. Tell me about things that I wouldn't expect. And so some of the best moments in my courtroom scenes happened from talking to these people who had done court martials before. So I ran through my scenarios. I had my experts read sections to make sure they were right. Because what do I know about military justice?
Do you do that a lot?
Yeah, I do. And it's because I love learning about new worlds. I sort of love learning new things. I want to write, when I write scenes that I've done by doing research, I want my sources to feel that I've been accurate. And yet at the same time, I'm writing fiction. So fiction always sort of pushes the boundaries. And so there would be things that happen in my novels that wouldn't happen in real life, but are exciting and could happen.
What was it like when you found out that Morgan Freeman and Ashley Judd and Jim Caviezel and so many other great actors are going to be playing these characters you invented in your head on the silver screen?
I had a couple of my books optioned. And when you're young and you're starting out, you sort of believe that an option means you're going to have a movie made, right? And as you get older and you go through it, you have experience, you realize it doesn't work that way. Lots of books are optioned, very few are made into movies. So High Crimes was optioned, and my agent said to me, "I just have a feeling this is going to be made into a movie. I said, yeah, I'll believe it when it's green lit. You tell me when it's green lit, right? Which means they give you the official go ahead to start making the movie." And so I remember one day my agent called up and said, "I think this is going to happen." And I said, "Yeah, right." I said, if it's going to happen, I want a cameo. I would like to be in this movie." And he said, "Joe, you're the writer. It doesn't happen that way. It's rare that it happens." I said, Hitchcock put himself in every one of his movies." "Joe, you're not Hitchcock." Okay, Hitchcock was the boss. He was the director. So anyway, there was a time when they called up and they said, "This is basically a project people are circling in Hollywood, and we have a director." And I said, "Yeah, right." And then they called up and they said that Morgan Freeman was cast in the role. The thing is, I cast Morgan Freeman in that role when I was writing the book. I had a picture of Morgan Freeman up on my wall while I was writing, and then I had his voice in my head. So when they decided that Morgan Freeman was going to be in it, I just sort of thought, this is beyond cool. This is amazing. At first I had no input in the screenplay. I sort of talked to the screenwriters a number of times. They asked me questions. But then my agent called up and said the director is willing to give you a cameo. And they flew me out there, and I talked to the director, and they instantly promoted me from being a member of the jury. That was my first. That was the first cameo I was going to play, to being a prosecutor, to being a member of the prosecution team. So I hung out. I was on the set for 5 days, and the director, Carl Franklin, his name was, called me aside once and said, "I'm getting all these notes from the studio. They want to have a new scene with Ashley and Morgan. And can you help me out here? Because I'm frazzled." And we sort of sat there and brainstormed. and came up with some ideas for a scene. So I did have some serious input in the movie as it turned out.
How
It is
cool.
amazing, though. I got to say, I wrote that book sitting by myself, working on a computer, one guy in a room, to all of a sudden have basically 500 people involved in producing this movie. Uh, and the sets were based on the sets that I described in my book. I mean, they read my book and took notes and created the set. So I sat there and I took a tour of the brig of where where Claire's husband was imprisoned, and it was just like I described it in my book. Uh, it's really cool. I mean, people say, so how does it feel to have your book brought to life? And I sort of think, no, actually, it was brought to life when I wrote it. You know, but it's amazing to see it happen as a movie because you're seeing someone else's interpretation of the story.
Did you have a similar experience with Paranoia?
Well, different experience.
Please share.
Okay.
Thank you again.
With Paranoia, the producers did not want me involved, and they were pretty dead set against that. They did not want me to have a cameo. They did not want me to read the screenplay. They wanted to keep me out of it. A lot of people in Hollywood are afraid of the writer, And the writer of a book is someone who can only be trouble to them. So they did let me come visit the set. So I was able to visit the set and meet the actors. I met Harrison Ford, I met Gary Oldman, Amber Heard, Liam Hemsworth, and talked to them for a bit. And that was exciting. But, the movie that they made was really different from the book that I wrote. Some people liked the movie. I really disliked it, I got to tell you.
Way before you saw Harrison Ford and Gary Oldman turn another of your bestsellers, Paranoia, into a blockbuster, where did you first get the idea for a .com setting? That was a really cool one.
I really wanted to shake things up again, and I sort of thought, why don't I do a character who's young, hates his job, doesn't love his job, hates his job, kind of sardonic, and tell the book in his voice. So I really, the voice of Paranoia is different from the voice of my earlier ones, where it's the narrator and it's sort of an omniscient narrator. In the case of Paranoia, it's the voice of this guy who, as I said, hates his job, but becomes endearing to us as he goes through his adventures and has has a struggle with his father, whom he really dislikes. So I wanted to write something that, was different. I also sort of, in a sense, psychoanalyzed Adam. I sort of thought, okay, his father's a jerk. He's probably going to be looking for a father figure. And that was sort of behind, I didn't put this in the book, but that was sort of behind his going to work for the CEO of this new company that he's basically spying on. And beginning to really admire this guy. And it's because of his psychological background. So that's sort of how Paranoia came to birth, really.
Using a psychological thriller like that masterpiece as an example, what are some of the twists and turns that you really recommend an aspiring thriller author needs to have to keep their book paced for readers to be excited from page one to the end?
The main thing is to defeat expectations.
Please elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, people who read thrillers, as a rule, have read a lot of other thrillers. And they know the tricks of the trade, they know what to expect. And what you've got to do is surprise that smart, experienced reader. And, and veer off, make a left turn where they expect a right turn.
Yeah.
So wherever you defeat the expectations of the reader finds it really pleasurable. So basically, what you do is you say, all right, what's expected to happen in this next scene? Let's do the opposite.
It must have been a proud moment to win Barry Award for Best Thriller for Company Men. It's such a great title, too. Tell fans a little bit about how you come up with your titles.
Well, with the title, just talking about the title, company man came to me early on because my dad used to use that expression, and he meant it disparagingly. Oh yeah, well he's just a company man, uh, meaning that he has no soul of his own. He's just sort of obeys the company and et cetera. So I sort of was writing. I started writing the book, and I sort of thought, well, he's a family man, but he's also a company man. And company man is not always a bad thing. Company man could mean that he is loyal to this organization of people. So company man, the title came to me pretty early on. Um, so did the title Paranoia. And that really started with, I had read a quote in a book about Silicon Valley, and I forget exactly how the line went, but it's like, you've basically in Silicon Valley, you've got to be paranoid. It was more elegantly phrased than that. And I sort of thought, paranoia, this is what my book's about here. Um, there have been plenty of books that I've written where I had a title that sucked or a title that the publisher didn't want. In the case of Zero Hour, for example, I had initially titled it something different. And the studio, when they bought the book, said, we can't use this title because it is the title of an existing movie we've made already. And that was called Prince of Darkness. And so they said, you have to have another title. And so what I said, well, you help me out here. You make movies, you help me out. And they hired some guy who was a title expert who generated 20 pages of titles. And one was worse than the next. They were really, really bad. And I read all these and I just thought, I can do better than that. And the title just sort of came to me from reading one of my scenes. When someone says, when is the 0 hour? It's a phrase that's used. And I sort of thought, that's a good title. I bet it's been used a bunch of times, and it hadn't been. I checked on Amazon and places like that, bookstores. So the title presented itself to me at that point.
You have such wildly entertaining supporting cast characters in your book, Killer Instinct being no exception. Could we use that one to talk a little bit about your process for creating them?
Killer Instinct came from when I was doing research for Paranoia. I basically wanted to know what it was like to work in the corporate world. And, I never did. So I interviewed CEOs and I interviewed new employees in corporations. I talked to someone, I talked to his boss, I would talk to his subordinate. And I saw in one guy's office these posters, a couple of posters that had these sort of military phrases on them. It was all about teamwork and that kind of thing. And I sort of thought, this guy who has these posters there, he was never in the military, but he sort of loves these posters. These motivate him and inspire him. And I thought, what if someone who actually was in the military was in this position? How would he feel about it? And it kind of evolved from that. What would happen if a guy who's not really ambitious befriends someone who has an agenda and helps him, using his skills acquired in the military, helps him advance in the corporation? So that was sort of how it started originally. Kurt Semko was one of my favorite characters as well, still is. And he was a far more important character than Jason Stedman, the protagonist of the book. Kurt had to be believable. He had to be someone who could be likable enough to be Jason's friend and yet be a bad guy. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about Kurt and writing him, talking to people. I invented him. He wasn't based on anyone I knew. I invented him and I just loved the character so much that whenever he interacted with Jason, the book came alive to me.
Versus characters that are maybe based on a real life muse, are your favorite the ones that come wholly out of your imagination?
Yep. I would say that's right. I love the character of Ben Ellison in Extraordinary Powers, where he's this guy who has an espionage background, but he's a lawyer. he's doing something kind of boring. And and that was written in the first person, as I recall. And it was a character that I really got into. Uh, so I prefer some characters to others. The only one, as you know, I brought back is Nick Heller.
Turning to the best-selling Nick Heller series, who fans first meet in Vanished, what did you really want to do differently with Nick on the page than past protagonists?
You know, a series character is different from a standalone protagonist.
Very much.
A standalone protagonist has his world or her world turned upside down in the course of the book. A series character cannot have his world turned upside down in every book. It's just not plausible. And you know he's not going to be killed off as long as that character continues. So it had to be someone who had a set of skills, but I also wanted him to be a fun, contrarian kind of character. And I sort of thought about my favorite series characters. I love Jack Reacher. I love a character named Travis McGee, who's written in the books by John D. MacDonald, and Robert B. Parker's Spencer for Hire, the Spencer character. And all of them were smart, kind of smart ass, had a sense of humor, and were contrarians, were sort of rebels in a sense. So that was the sort of psychological profile I wanted for Nick Heller. So what kind of expertise could I give him? I didn't want to make him an ex-spy. I sort of felt that had been done too much as just a regular spy. Navy SEALs felt to me like that had been done too much. But when I wrote Nick Heller, Special Forces is more common now, but it was less common as a background back then. I wanted him to have a military background, but not be like Jack Reacher, a loner or a wanderer. I wanted him to be different. The other thing about Nick Heller that was a distinction that was important to me is that he comes from a wealthy background. And he knows the world of business and of wealth in a way that you can't know unless you've been there.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I knew that I wanted my stories to take place in the world of finance and the world of great money and that kind of thing. So I wanted someone who had some knowledge and expertise in it.
I've always wanted to ask, what do you feel is the key to writing convincing action scenes for fans on the page?
When I write action scenes, I choreograph them in my head, and I think of them as movies. I think of them in cinematic terms. And I wanted Nick Heller in particular to be someone who is trained in close combat. And he's not a superhero. He's not 6'7", and 280 pounds or anything like that. He's a regular guy who happens to have this set of skills and has the confidence that you get from having that set of skills. So I actually have a source who helps me with some of my action scenes, who trained the Marines in martial arts.
Very cool.
And so in the Army, you're also trained in martial arts and close combat. And so I sort of use that as a way of freshening up Nick's skills. He's not just a street fighter. He's a guy who actually is experienced in close combat. And that's what I thought that would make him more interesting.
You really took readers off to a lot of exciting new locations with new antagonists and everything else one would want in a thriller, in books like Buried Secrets, Guilty Minds, and Plan B. Tell us what really keeps it exciting for you when you're writing Nick for a new book.
You've got to have a character that you really like and who's infinitely interesting and has a lot of potential. So I made a character who had a kind of a weird family background, who had been in the military, who had been a spy, who has this expertise, and yet is not, to put it, is not a company man, is someone who's a sort of a rebel. So my advice to someone who's writing a series is to think about your character and think, would I want to write 10 books with this character, not just one? There are some characters who you can't live with. There are some characters who who you can and who begin to unfold the more you write them. And with Nick Heller, each book, I have more and more about his background that comes out, more and more about his personal life, which is not something that I planned at the outset. I sort of planned Nick as a character who had this set of skills and this expertise, this background. I sort of thought he's going to come from a screwed up family. And that's why in Vanished, for example, it's the relationship with his brother who's kind of a bad guy. And yet at the same time, he loves his brother. So I wanted this Vanished to be a story about two brothers. Yeah, I've got two brothers. So it felt real to me. He's a Boston-based character. I set him in Boston. He works in Boston. He ended up there. And yet when I worked on Vanished, I knew it had to take place in Washington. It was a Washington conspiracy story. But then I figured out a way to sort of move him to Boston, so I didn't have to do all that research. I had to hire researchers for Vanished, for the Washington stuff. When I write scenes that take place in Boston, I don't have to do any research. I wanted to do a story that juxtaposed the high and the low, by which I mean I wanted there to be a story about the power of gossip in the world of the internet and how powerful and dangerous that is. And I wanted that to be juxtaposed with dignity and gravitas. And there's nothing more gravitas ridden than the Supreme Court. So I basically placed this kind of trashy tabloid online magazine against this dignified, respected Supreme Court justice. There were two worlds that clashed. And that's sort of what motivated the story.
Nick Heller and Jack Reacher meet up for the first time on the page in Good and Valuable Consideration. How much fun was it co-writing with Lee Child?
At ITW, we came up with this idea for a book of stories in which two characters by different authors meet and interact in one way or another. And I sort of thought, who is the coolest character around here? Who do I want my guy, Nick Heller, to interact with? Jack Reacher and Lee Child. And so I emailed Lee and I said, would you be willing to do this? And he said, sure, that sounds like fun. Lee and I work very differently. This was interesting. So Lee does not, and he's famous for this, he doesn't plot things out in advance. Every day he starts writing, he doesn't know what's going to happen until he starts writing. And I like to have some plan in place. So Lee came up with the premise of two guys meeting in a bar. And he wrote the opening of it and sent it to me. And I read this and I sort of thought, okay, I wrote to him, I said, so what do you envision happening next? And he said, I have no idea, it's up to you. So I wrote the next chunk. And what happened was Lee and I started writing scenes in which we would put the characters in some kind of a bind, short moments in the story, and make it as hard for each other as possible. So Lee would basically write something, I would say, damn, what's Nick going to do now? And so we sort of wrote the thing chunk by chunk by chunk by chunk. And each one, Lee had no idea what was going to happen. I had no idea what was going to happen.
Congratulations on hitting the 10-year mark with Nick Heller in House of Fire. What keeps Nick fresh on the page for you after knowing him for so many years and so many different books?
In The House on Fire, I wanted Nick to, I wanted us to learn something about his background that was moving. And I created a background for him that I hadn't thought of before. And an ex-lover. And so I sort of, it felt like fresh new material to me. And so this is what I loved about writing House on Fire, was that it felt fresh as I started it. It was different from any other book I've written.
Returning to recent standalones like Suspicion and The Fixer, Is it really challenging for you to come up with new plots from book to book after doing it for so many years, or is that one of the most exciting parts of a new project for you?
A couple of things. One is I had seen a movie called The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, where a great sum of gold is discovered and it takes over the character's life. So I wanted to do something that felt like the treasure of the Sierra Madre. Um, I had also just been through a big renovation of an old house on Cape Cod. And I was talking to the guys who were doing the demo work, and they found old newspapers in the walls and receipts and this kind of stuff. Very, very cool. And I said, "You ever find money?" This one guy said, "Yeah, I did actually. I found this piggy bank that had been hidden in the wall and apparently forgotten about, or someone died or something like that." So it wasn't that much. It was like about around $1,000 or something like that. But still, it's found money, and it was mine. And I sort of thought, well, this is a way to do it. I mean, take the old familiar conceit of someone finding a lot of money and having it take over and change his life. So I wanted Rick Hoffman to be a guy who is evolving as a character, as a person, and have the discovery of this money, which seems like a great thing, turn out to be a painful, difficult thing as well.
Taking Mike Tanner and the Switch, that scenario could happen to anyone. Is that important for you to connect the commonalities between the reader and the character in terms of what they could both experience together?
Yeah, I mein, in this case, I was on book tour, and you have to take your laptop out, and I put it in that bin, and this guy took my laptop because he was behind me and he had a MacBook Air as well. And I said, "Excuse me, sir, I think you've got mine." And then it occurred to me, because I'm always looking for ideas, it occurred to me, what if that happened to a character where his laptop is switched? So how could that be exciting? What if there's something on the laptop that he shouldn't see? And what if there's classified information? And there was all this rhetoric in the campaign about Hillary's emails and how she had all this classified stuff and on her home computer, home server. And I sort of thought, let's make her a female senator, Hillary-like in some ways, who has basically bent the rules and has classified information on a laptop. And what would that do to a regular guy? And I wanted someone who had nothing to do with that world. Michael Tanner is just a regular guy who's into coffee, like I am, and has a coffee business. And one of the reasons I did it that way was because I wanted to do some research into the coffee business. I wanted to know what it was, how coffee is sold in the U.S. and what it would be like to own a coffee shop. So in each of my books, I do research that is something that is a personal, idiosyncratic interest to me. And I figure if it's interesting to me, it's going to be interesting to the reader.
With Power Play, which I bet becomes your next film adaptation, where did that concept first hit you to take corporate executives and have them taken hostage out in the wilderness at a retreat?
I was doing research for, I think it was Company Man, and I was talking to CFOs, chief financial officers. And the CFO mentioned that there had just been the corporate retreat in a place where there was no internet and there's no cell phone reception, nothing. And he said, that was really good for us to sort of get away from our world for a couple of days. And I said, but what if something had happened and you were totally out of touch? And he said, well, it didn't. And I just sort of thought, wow, what if? And I love the idea of corporate retreats and the kind of training exercises they have, trust exercises they have in these corporate retreats. And I sort of thought, what if one went really bad? And I actually said to this CFO, if you or someone at the top of the company wanted to embezzle a great deal of money, how would you do it? And this one CEO, this woman, told me exactly, she fantasized about it. Here's how I would get away with it. And, she would never do anything like that. but there's a part of her brain that thought about it. And I heard that and I just sort of said, I'm taking it. That's mine.
We reach one of your most recent bestsellers, Judgment, after 30 years as a master thriller writer. What really keeps it exciting for you when you sit down to work on a new book like this one?
I like to do things slightly different with each book, yet at the same time remain the same. You know, they're all going to be thrillers that generally are about ordinary people who get into extraordinary circumstances. And I wanted to do a story in which someone of great repute, a well-respected judge, gets into trouble for personal reasons. You know, she has an affair, then what? So, I mean, you ask me sort of how I get excited for each one of my books. You can't, I have read books by experienced long-term authors, and it felt to me like they were redoing the same, they were doing the same thing over and over again. They were copying from themselves. And I thought, well, that's not fun. I want each book to be an adventure. I mean, if I'm not excited, the reader's not going to be excited. So with each one of my books, I shake things up to one extent or another. I have a different kind of a character. I have a plot that's very fresh to me. So I basically like to, I said defeat expectations. I also like to write books where someone reading, my regular readers are going to say, whoa, Joe's going somewhere else with this book, you know? And I think that is cool for my readers.
You've won about every award there is out there, and we've touched on a few of them tonight. Are any most personally important to you?
I mean, I've won the Thriller Award from ITW. I've won the Barry. I've won the Strand Award. I'm not going to pick favorites. I mean, they all actually meant a lot to me because each of these awards was given by my peers, by people who, not just critics, but people who do this for a living, who write for a living. So that really meant something to me. So I don't have one favorite over another of the thrillers, of the awards rather.
You co-founded the International Thriller Writers Foundation. What's some of the most rewarding work you've done with new authors through that program?
ITW, International Thriller Writers, began with a sort of dissatisfaction from the mystery world, where a lot of thriller writers sort of feel like they're second-class citizens. You know, so that the awards in the mystery world are given to mystery writers. There's a difference between a mystery and a thriller. And a mystery is a whodunit. And a thriller is a howdunit. It's not so important who the bad guy is. We might meet the bad guy from the beginning. We're going to see it play out. And I think we all felt that thriller writing needed to get sort of more established in the world of awards and that kind of thing. So it started with a dissatisfaction, and it turned into this organization where famous writers hang out with non-famous writers, with newbie writers, and the thing I love about it, a couple of things. One is I love hanging out with my fellow writers and talking about the business. You know, it's a lonely job being a writer. And it's great to sort of have this contact with your colleagues and realize they feel the same way about certain things, or they have advice about dealing with your agent or dealing with your publisher. There's so much to learn from one another, which before ITW, we had no way of knowing. I also love meeting younger writers because I sort of feel that when I started out, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to get an agent. I didn't know how to get a publisher. I had no idea what I was doing. And I would read books in the library about how to sell your books, and none of it helped. I had to sort of learn my way through it. To me, the greatest thing ITW does is take newbie writers or aspiring writers and teach them how to break in. And I give them advice. I give writers advice that I wish I had gotten when I was starting out.
Along those lines, please share a few of those here.
Yeah. One is that you've got to be stubborn, that you're not going to make it unless you're really determined. And the most successful writers are not the most talented writers, they are the most determined writers. Those that really insist on that, you know what, I am a writer, I don't care what you say, you rejected me, I don't care, I'm going to keep going. But at the same time, you have to learn how to take criticism and learn from rejection. You know, every writer I know has been rejected. I mean, everyone, Lee Child, everyone has been rejected by an agent or a publisher. Uh, and at first, it hurts because you're sort of wondering, maybe I'm not a writer after all. If they're saying I'm no good. No, if you think you're a writer, you've got to stick it out and be stubborn, believe in yourself, and at the same time learn from rejection, get better at it. I basically was rejected by a number of agents when I started out, and I talked to those agents about what they didn't like about my book. And I took notes and I did revisions and I made a much better book as a result of it. So those early rejections really taught me a lot. So I tell people, I tell young writers, you've got to do two things at once. You've got to be stubborn, and yet you've also got to be open-minded.
In closing, when you look back for a moment, are there any titles that you're proudest of in your catalog? And what can fans expect next?
Sometimes parents do prefer one child over another. It does happen in reality. Um, I've got a number of my books that are my favorites. I mean, Paranoia, for example, for me was this sort of the book in which I sort of broke free of a lot of conventions and sort of decided to write in a much more casual, speech-like way. Um, and it was my first New York Times bestseller. And that was really exciting. So I love I love Paranoia. I also love Killer Instinct because I love Kurt Semko. Um, I I love Buried Secrets is my scariest book, and it is so there are scenes in there that are just incredible, almost unbearable. Um, and I loved Vanished because I loved writing about the brothers. Um, so I don't know.
That
Some of
covers
my books I prefer to others. All I want to say right now is that it's a psychological thriller, and I'm loving writing it, which is great, which is a good sign.
Mr. Finder, it's been such a thrill. Thank you so much again for being on About the Authors TV.
Bye-bye.